Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to continue with the book Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. Now, tonight we're going to cover two chapters. One is called The Lover, and the other one is called What Slaves Are Taught to Think of the North. Now, in the chapter The Lover, Harriet Jacobs falls in love with a free black man. But she has little hopes of actually marrying this man, even though she falls in love with him, as she starts the chapter by even questioning, why does the slave ever love? Now, how does she know that it would be very difficult for her to marry this free black man? And what do we learn from this chapter about the institution of slavery? Now, she knows that Dr. Flint won't consent to the marriage because Dr. Flint wants her for himself. So this she already knows, and we know from previous chapters, and she even states it in this, that this free black man, even if he wants to purchase her freedom, Dr. Flint won't allow it because he wouldn't allow it in previous chapters where people offer to get her freedom. And the mistress, even though the mistress would love to be rid of Harriet Jacobs from the plantation, because as we covered in the last video, the hatred that the mistress has for Harriet Jacobs, she does not want to get rid of her through marriage. Number one, because Harriet would be happy to get married. And number two, if Harriet Jacobs were to marry, she would still be living in the same vicinity. And this mistress wants her sold to a slave trader to be treated harshly and to be sold down the river, never to be seen again. However, it's not the choice of the mistress. So what do we learn about the institution of slavery from this chapter? Well, interesting enough is that Harriet Jacobs said if she married this free black man, she would still remain a slave under Dr. Flint, and any children that she would bear from her marriage would also be under the institution of slavery. Because on the slave plantation and on the institution of slavery, children follow the lot of the mother. So any children that she has are slaves, and this is to build up the wealth of the slave master. The slave master wants the women to have children because if she has more children, he has more slaves, which increases his wealth. And under the institution of slavery, if the master would beat her or flog her or whatever, the husband would have no power to protect her from the master because she remains a slave. And we learn that also, that even through marriage, she doesn't get freedom. She remains a slave. So she knows that she's never going to marry this black man from the, so she asked the question, why does the slave ever love? And it's very interesting in this chapter because you get to see her writing skills. And I just want to read a little bit so you can see the advanced writing skills that Harriet Jacobs has. Why does the slave ever love? Why allow the tendrils of the heart to twine around objects which may at any moment be wrenched away by the hand of violence? When separations come by the hand of death, the pious soul can vow in resignation and say, "Not my will, but thine be done, O Lord." But when the ruthless hand of man strikes the blow, regardless of the misery he causes, it is hard to be submissive. I did not reason thus when I was a young girl. Youth will be youth. I loved and I indulged the hope that the dark clouds around me would turn out a bright lining. I forgot that in the land of my birth, the shadows are too dense for light to penetrate. And then she quotes a poem by George Gordon and Lord Byron. Now, from reading this chapter, it reminds me there were two instances in this chapter where Dr. Flint actually hits Harriet Jacobs out of jealousy and out of rage. So this is just another demonstration of how sick this man is, because he wants Harriet Jacobs to surrender to his will. And previous to this, he promised, I'll never hit you, and it's me protecting you from the mistress because I won't allow her to hit or flog you. But once he finds out that she loves another man, a black man, he gets so upset that he asked her a question, and he wanted an honest answer about, do you love this man? And she gave him an honest answer, and he hit her. And in this chapter, she says that she hates her master. And I want to just read that little section. Reader, did you ever hate? I hope not. I never did but once, and I trust I never shall again. Somebody has called it, in quotes, the atmosphere of hell, and I believe it is so. And this was after the doctor hit her and spoke ill of the black man that she wanted to marry. So she threatened, he hit her once when he asked her a question, and he forbid her to talk to this man ever again. And then Harriet Jacobs actually ran into the man and spoke to him. The master saw it and he hit her again. But Harriet Jacobs informed the man that she didn't want to see him because she didn't want his life to be in danger because of her. Now, the next chapter, what slaves are taught to think of the North. This is a very short chapter, but it's very interesting because the slave masters would lie to the slaves about what the North is. And they would tell the slaves, you got it better on the plantation because here on the plantation you have food, you have water, you have a place to stay, you have shelter, you have everything you need. And if you go up north, you have to fend for yourself. And they tell the slaves that they have ventured north and have seen former slaves. And in this chapter, she actually gives an instance where a slave master said he saw one of the former slaves, and the slave was in such bad conditions that the slave begged him to bring her back to the South, and he refused to do so because he didn't want to be looked at as a man to bring such a wretched creature back to the South and to the institution of slavery. So it's very interesting, and many of the slaves on the plantation would use that as an excuse of why they don't want to be free, because they don't want to have to fend for themselves and live a life of worse poverty than what they are in. And she also talks about what Southerners think of Northerners. Now, she said that Southerners always speak ill of the Northerners, but Northerners that come down to the South praise the South, the Southern hospitality. And she said that when Northerners become slave masters, they're worse slave masters than Southern slave masters, because they feel that they have something to prove. They have to prove that they're not the, quote, liberal-minded people of the North, that they moved down south to have slaves. And she said in this chapter, even the slaves despised Northerners. Now, there's a section in this chapter that I want to read because it's very interesting, where Harriet Jacobs talks about the black man as being inferior. And I'm going to do a separate little segment on my videos of just reading this section. There's a section in this book that I also find very interesting where she says that there are few slaves that protect their wives and daughters from their slave masters. And she referred to these slaves as being civilized and Christianized. So she says that the Christianized black men or slaves would protect their wives and daughters and stand up to the slave master. And then she said the other ones were so buried under the institution of slavery that they wouldn't protect their wives and daughters. And I would like to read that section to you as well. Some poor creatures have been brutalized by the lash that they will sneak out of the way to give their masters free access to their wives and daughters. Do you think this proves the black man to belong to an inferior order of beings? What would you be if you had been born and brought up a slave, with generations of slaves for ancestors? I admit that the black man is inferior, but what is it that makes him so? It is the ignorance in which white men compel him to live. It is the torturing whip that lashes manhood out of him. It is the fierce bloodhounds of the South and the scarcely less cruel human bloodhounds of the North who enforce the fugitive slave law. They do the work. Yeah, the fugitive slave law. So again, she brings up the fugitive slave law. And she continues to bring that up because that's just a terrible law that she just wants you to recognize that even the slave who makes it to the North is not completely free because they still live in fear of being brought back to the South because of the fugitive slave law. So in her eyes, she doesn't want you to think white people in the North are great and white people in the South are terrible. She wants you to recognize that the whites in the North are just as bad as the whites in the South because they have a law to hunt down slaves and bring them back down to the South. So during the institution of slavery, many slaves escaped down to South America, and many of the slaves escaped north all the way into Canada. And when we went over the story of Madison, Washington, you know, that boat that they stole, you know, it went all the way to the Virgin Island, or islands that were owned by Great Britain, because if a slave reached an area of Great Britain, they could be free as well. So the Fugitive Slave Act, she likes to bring that up over and over to keep reminding us that when she eventually escapes, and she also alludes to her escaping because she mentions her brother William. And I want to read another section about she feels sorry for slaves and the ignorance of slaves. So I'll read another section. Some believe that the abolitionists have already made them free and that it is established by law, but that their masters prevent the law from going into effect, which is believable. One woman begged me to get a newspaper and read it over. She said her husband told her that the black people had sent word to the Queen of America that they were all slaves, that she didn't believe it and went to Washington City to see the president about it. They quarreled. She drew her sword upon him and swore that he should help her to make them all free. That poor, ignorant woman thought that America was governed by a queen to whom the president was subordinate. I wish the president was subordinate to Queen Justice. So there's many things going on the slave plantation, many conversations having taking place between the slaves, and they all sound, some of them sound crazy, some of them sound plausible, but they all hope one day, or it seems that the majority of them one day all want to be free. So that's what we learn in the institution of slavery. Now, the next chapter that I'm going to cover is called Sketches of Neighboring Slaveholders, and we're on chapter 9. And I think that's going to be a very interesting chapter to see what's going on in neighboring slave plantations. So this is Jason with Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.